Hey, gang, coming up on our Finding Better podcast, we're doing something we've never done before. Mr. Byrnes Yamashita is joining me, and he's interviewing me as the author of my book, American Grit: From a Japanese American Concentration Camp Rises an American War Hero. He interviewed me in Hawaii over the holidays, and it went so well that we decided that we'd share it with you. So we hope you like it. Now, here's the thing. I'm not here to sell you books. You can download my book for free at johnsuzuki.com. Okay. You can also go to Amazon. It's an Amazon bestseller and buy it. But there you go. So sit back, take a listen. I hope you learned something. It's an amazing, amazing story. Here we go.
Hello, my name is Byrnes Yamashita. I'm the president of the Nisei Veterans Legacy. We're a small nonprofit organization based in Honolulu, Hawaii. And our mission is to try to keep alive the story of the Nisei soldiers of World War II for our younger generations. The Nisei were second generation Japanese Americans, all of whom were born in the United States, American citizens, but at the outbreak of the war, their loyalty to the United States was called into question when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Eventually, there would go on to be four different units of the Nisei soldiers, Japanese Americans, that served during the war. We're going to talk today about one of them, Mr. Shiro Kashino, who served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Besides that unit, there was also the 100th Infantry Battalion, the Military Intelligence Service, and the 1399th Engineer Construction Battalion. Allow me to introduce Mr. John Suzuki, the author of a new book called American Grit, which chronicles the life of Mr. Kashino before, during, and after the war. Hello, John.
Hey, Burns, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
This is
John,
this is this is fun. Thank you for doing this.
yeah, sure. My pleasure. Can we start out with John, with you giving us a little background of your story, your personal story?
My personal story?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, my personal story. Born in Japan. My dad was part of the United States Air Force at the time, and so I was born on a United States Air Force base. Grew up in Los Angeles, and eventually moved to Hawaii in 1991, and and was there just for a couple 3 years, and then moved my family over to Seattle. And I spent most of my career in high tech with companies like IBM and Sun Microsystems, and I ended my career with Expedia, but always in high tech. And I retired in 22. Um, and part of the reason why retired in 22 was to finish this book that you and I are talking about, American Grit, because I'd been working on it at the time for 15 years, and I decided it was time to finish it. So in 23, published the book. It became an Amazon bestseller, and in 24, I launched a podcast called Finding Better, and and that's been the joy of my life. It's all about helping people find better in their lives, and uh, and here we are in 25. I'm
Yeah,
here with
thank you
you.
very much.
I
Yeah,
lived my
thank you
whole
very
life
much.
for this moment.
Thank you very much for that broad brush overview. So, to dig in a little bit more into the details, was your family affected by the Japanese incarceration during World War II?
Yeah, no, they weren't. My mother was actually in Japan, and so she was during the war. She was a teenager, when all the fire bombings and it was just terrible. I mean, war is hell. We know this. My dad was lived in a little town called Davenport, which is in eastern Washington, which was outside what was called the military exclusion zone on the West Coast, where all of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast were rounded up and incarcerated in concentration camps scattered across the country. So he was not affected, uh, though he volunteered for the army when World War II broke out. And his story, his just real quick, they didn't know what to do with him. He was in the army, and so they had him in the middle of a bunch of garlic farms in Northern California, digging 6 by 6 foot holes all day under guard and filling them up and then digging holes again because they didn't know what to do with this Japanese American guy. But eventually he went on, as you mentioned, the military intelligence service. He went on to join this top secret group of people who fought in the Pacific theater against the Japanese, which of itself was a monumentally gigantic accomplishment of heroism and bravery.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, growing up, your family was not directly affected by the incarceration. Were you aware of what had happened to the Nikkei community in the West Coast as you were growing up?
I did. I did. I was acutely aware of it.
Hmm.
My dad made sure I knew of it because he
Hmm.
was in the army, and so I was very very aware of of the camps and what happened. And actually, growing up in Los Angeles, a lot of my friends' parents were affected. A lot of my friends' parents were in these camps, and so we talked about that, about their experiences. Every once in a while, not nearly as much as I wanted to, because nobody wanted to talk about it.
Right,
Nobody
right.
wanted to talk about it because
Hmm.
they felt such a acute sense of shame. And
Right.
you know, I
Japanese
think
cultural values at
it's
work.
the Japanese cultural values, right? I mean, it's something bad happens, it must have been their fault somehow,
Hmm.
and they just have to, shikaraganai. You, shit happens, so suck it up and get on with it, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's one of the things was that nobody really wanted to talk about their experiences. Even Shiro Kashino, who I wrote this book about, he didn't really talk about his experience and everything that he did until he was diagnosed with cancer. And he realized that if he didn't talk about it, no, no,
It would die with him. His
it's
stories
going to
would die.
die with him. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
in the last 4 years, he got out there and talked about his experience.
Mhm. Well, thank you for sharing that. That experience of the Nikkei community on the West Coast contrasts sharply with the experience that we had here in Hawaii. And many of us, like myself, grew up in Hawaii. We're very unaware of what happened to our brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles on the U.S. continent during the war. And here in Hawaii, most of the Japanese community were left alone. Okay, the military and FBI, who were conscious of a potential threat from the Japanese community, only incarcerated and arrested the so-called leaders of our community.
Right,
These were
right.
Buddhist and Shinto priests, educated people that ran Japanese language schools, the editors and publishers of our Japanese language newspapers, businessmen with strong ties to Japan. These were the people that were picked up. There was 400 of them arrested on the afternoon of December 7th. So they already had done their intelligence on who these people were. Eventually, just shy of 2,000 of them were arrested and incarcerated. Now, their families were not immediately removed, such as on the West Coast. So these men, most of them were sent to federal Department of Justice prisons scattered around the country. Eventually, some of their families joined them because they had no means of surviving without the breadwinner husband. So some of these families were later moved to internment camps administered by the War Relocation Authority for the Japanese families. But for most of us, especially those of us that have humble roots on the sugar plantations here in Hawaii, our families were not considered threats, our grandfathers, and so they were not affected. And just as you mentioned, even those who were wrongfully imprisoned, just because they were leaders of the community, their families didn't want to talk about it either because there was a
Nobody,
sense of
nobody.
shame. Okay,
Yeah.
so with this backdrop and understanding, what your experience was, um, how did you get come to learn about this story of Mr. Shiro Kashino?
Yeah, it was a gift. It was a gift, and it became a bit of a mission and a calling. My mom was living in a Japanese assisted living center in Seattle, and I would go and visit her all the time.
What year
And
was this? Sorry to interrupt. What year was this?
this was in 2008.
Okay, thank you.
2008. Yeah. And as I went into the elevator, there was this little flyer taped up on the wall that said pilgrimage to Minidoka. So I looked at it and I said, I don't know what a pilgrimage is, and I don't know what a Minidoka is. So I just blew it off and just didn't pay attention to it. For the following 6 weeks, I saw that flyer everywhere. And finally, the day before this event was supposed to happen, a flyer showed up on my windshield. And so finally I said, okay, all right, I get it. I'll find out what the heck this is all about. So I called up, and it was a pilgrimage of folks who wanted to go to learn about one of the United States concentration camps of World War II in Twin Falls, outside of Twin Falls, Idaho. And it was to happen the next day. So I asked the person, I said, I'm sure you're sold out. And she says, boy, this must be your lucky day. One person just canceled, and that seat is yours. And so the next day, I find myself on a 12-hour bus ride to Twin Falls, Minnesota, or Twin Falls, Idaho, from Seattle. And I don't know why I'm there. I don't know, and during the bus ride, everybody in the bus, we had 12 hours. Everybody on the bus, got onto this little karaoke microphone and talked about why they were going. And everybody on the bus had family who was there, or they were there because they were still around at that time. They all had some connection to that experience during World War II with this camp called Minidoka. And so they got to me, and I told them I told them almost exactly this. I have no idea why I'm here. I have no idea why I'm here. All I know is that I'm supposed to be here. My family wasn't affected. Um, and, I told the story about just having signed up the day before. And I did tell them, I said, but here's the thing. I have a feeling that on the bus ride home, it would be very, very clear why I'm on this trip. So on the third day of this pilgrimage, there was a remembrance service. And we were all sitting in front of this thing that looks like a billboard. The image on the screen is what it is, and it's an honor roll. It's an honor roll of all the men who volunteered out of that camp, out of the Minidoka concentration camp, to fight and die for the United States, to fight and die for the fight for the same army that put them and their families in that godforsaken camp to begin with, and the same army that would continue to hold their families while these guys went off to war. And a lot of them died. So imagine, I mean, who would do that? And of course, the thing that I thought of was, when a loved one dies in battle, a contingent of soldiers and officers comes to your home, presents you with an American flag and a gold star. Now, can you imagine, right? Being presented a gold star and American flag while you're in a concentration camp, being told that your son just died. I mean, it was just beyond my constant comprehension. I knew about the 442nd, I knew about the concentration camps, but I never heard of the people who volunteered out of these camps to fight and die for the United States Army. It was just mind-boggling, and it so that was my reason, and what I came back with was a purpose of eventually someday um, getting this story to become a major motion picture. And, be it Clint Eastwood or Mel Gibson or Steven Spielberg or any of those guys. And so, to the folks who are listening, if you know any of those people, please let me know because this is just a crazy, amazing story. And these guys joined this segregated army unit of Japanese Americans called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And just to kind of push to the punchline, they went on. This group of Japanese American soldiers went on to become the most decorated war unit in the history of the United States for its size and duration. And the gentleman that I wrote about, Shiro Kashino, was one of the most decorated men of the 442nd. And just an incredible. We're gonna get into that, but he got six Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, a Bronze Star. I mean, it was just crazy.
Can
So
I
I
ask you a
finished the
question?
book,
John, can
right?
I ask you a question? Can I ask
Yeah,
you a question?
please.
Okay, that's a great background in terms of how your initial motivation was. Now, what was the process you went through? Can you share like how you came across Mr. Kashino's story and how you
Yeah.
decided to write the book about him?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. From this, I knew about, like I said, the 442nd. I knew about the camps. I knew about two famous battles that the 442nd fought. One was called the Battle of the Lost Battalion in France, and the other one was called the Battle of the Gothic Line in Italy. And these are epic battles, very, very famous battles, some of the most famous battles in the history of the United States. And so I went on a Google search, and Google back then wasn't what it is today. And so, but what I did was I um, I Googled 442nd um, and the two battles of Battle of the Gothic Line and the Lost Battalion, and who was a soldier that volunteered out of Minidoka and fought in those two battles. And the name Shiro Kashino came up. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Then his background with the six Purple Hearts and a Silver Star and Bronze Star. And that's the guy. That's the guy I want to write about. And probably one of the most depressing days of my life was when I read further and realized that he had passed away in 1997, 11 years prior. But I wanted to write about his story. And so I learned that his widow, Louise Kashino, was still alive, or at least I didn't see any obituaries. And so I went on a mission to try to find her. And so I looked up all the white pages I could find, all telephone books I can find, and looked for all the Kashinos along the West Coast. And I found, I don't know, 11 or 12 of them. And I sent certified letters. This is back then. Certified letters to all of these people. And no answer. And so I did it again, hoping that I'd get a response. And one day, when I was in a little town in North Carolina, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, my phone rang. And the voice on the other side said, "Hi, John. My name is Louise Kashino. I received your letter." And that is a day I will never forget. So Louise, I eventually ended up meeting, um, was amazing. And she by as her profession, after her experience during World War II in Minidoka, she became a legal secretary. And as a legal secretary, she was one of the most organized people on planet Earth. And she had every one of the contacts of his buddies, the contact information for Senator Daniel Inouye, the contact information for all the men who won medals of honor. And she guided me. She guided me, and it was because of her that I was able to find my way to Italy and France, looking going through the battlefields of World War II, and yeah, so Louise, who was a magnificent, magnificent woman, she even showed me, Cash's letters, Mr. Kashino's letters that she had kept, that he had sent from her, from the battlefields, and I show some of the letters in the book. But that's that's
So
that's
this is
how.
kind of a stroke of luck, right? This was a stroke of
Oh my
luck
gosh.
that of all the soldiers you could have focused on, you find the one whose wife is like the most organized person ever, and then has this treasure trove of materials
Just
from which you
incredible.
can draw on to do the research for your
Yeah.
book, right?
And I
It's an
traveled
odd
all
set
over
of
the world with
circumstances
her.
that,
Yep. Yep. And that's why I
yeah,
call it a
yeah.
gift.
And you know, you
It really
commented,
was. Hmm. Go
right.
ahead.
You commented that when you finally got to meet Louise, you know, she shared with you what a humble and private man Mr. Kashino was. And
Yes.
so there's a little bit of irony to me that you discover his story 11 years after his passing. It was you were upset when you learned he had already passed, but if you had met him when he was still alive, Louise thought, hey, maybe he might not have let you write this story.
Oh, she said there's no
Can you
way in
talk about
hell
that?
he would he would have let me write the story because it wasn't about him, and he wouldn't even let his granddaughter write a homework assignment about him because it was not about him. It was about the 442nd. It was about it was about that collective experience of
Mm-hmm.
what the Niseis of World War II did. And so she was very clear to me. She says, John, if Shiro was here today, he would not let you write this story. And I told her, I said, Louise, you know what? Someday I'm going to meet that man. I'm going to meet Mr. Koshiro, right? I'm going to be where he is right now. And I don't want him to walk up to me and punch me in the mouth. I want him to give me a hearty handshake. And I said, are you sure it's okay? And she says, it'll be okay because I'm giving you my permission.
Mm-hmm.
And she says,
Mm-hmm.
I want you to write this story because the world needs to know about what happened. And so, so yeah, if he were alive, that this is going to sound terrible, but I would have had to wait until he died anyway.
Right, right.
And
So
so,
to me, this is just an amazing amount of a group of circumstances, right, that led you on this path of discovery to an
yeah,
internment camp that you had no connection with, to learn about their story, which then moves you to do something, to share
yeah,
the story with the rest of the world, right?
yeah,
And then you go on this search to find a proper subject matter. You find him, and somehow you find his wife, who has this remarkable amount of information to
amazing.
allow you to write this book at the depth of level of detail that you did, which brings Mr. Kashino's story alive for the rest of us. So, to me, when I hear you talk about this, it's just amazing, and you know these circumstances that led you down the path to where you are today. So let's dive a little bit into the man himself, and what drew you to his story, and talk about some of the things that you came to admire about his life.
Well, he was a bit of an orphan growing up because his parents, he grew up in Seattle, and his both of his parents died when he was very young. And he was the youngest of five kids, six kids, and they didn't know what to do with him, and so they knew that there's no way there were a lot of families that wanted to adopt him. There were families in Montana. There were even families in Japan, but they knew that Shiro would never accept that, and so they decided to keep him. And he kind of grew up on his own.
Mm-hmm.
And he grew up in a day during a time when sentiment towards Japanese folks was could be pretty negative, if not dangerous at some time. And he learned to fight for himself. And he learned to growing up. He the one thing that he would never accept was being called a Jap. Louise told me that that would always elicit a fight, a major fight. And so he learned how to fight on his own growing up, and he drew very clear lines of right and wrong. But he was amazing. He was part of the all-star high school football team in Seattle, And he was a gifted athlete, both in baseball and in football. And and again, he had a very, very clear sense of right and wrong, which which some people might agree with because everybody's got their own views of right and wrong. But his views aligned very much with mine. And so he, uh, I talk about his experience of what happened in high school and how he learned to fight because he got beat up a couple of times, but after those first couple of times, he never lost a fight after that. He just became a really good fighter, and which carried him into World War II. And and uh, if you were to think about the man he was the product of him growing up in kind of a disadvantaged way. So he learned to fight. He learned to fight. He was a little bit of a hothead, but that hothead kept his men safe and led them into victory in battle.
Hmm.
But he had, I think the thing that really, really sets him apart, and this is not just me, but this is talking to Medal of Honor recipients and the other and men who fought with him. They all say the same thing, that he was an amazing leader and he's an amazing fighter, and he never expected his men to do anything he wasn't willing to do. In fact, in battle, he would take on the most dangerous assignments because he didn't have parents who would grieve his loss, right? All of his men um, had parents who would be heartbroken if they died. So he figured, better me die than them.
Hmm.
And so he would take on the dangerous assignments himself.
Can I ask a question, John? So this is a issue that comes up from time to time about the young Japanese American men whose families had been incarcerated in these camps. And when the army finally decided, after initially declaring them enemy aliens and unfit to serve in the US military. After a period of time, after different groups proved their loyalty to the United States, the American government decides to go out and allow these men to serve their country and starts recruiting them. Okay, so not everybody ran to the recruiting office to
Right.
sign up, right? There were some that were saying, "Wait a minute, look at what you did to my family, and look, and now you're asking me to go and fight and maybe die for your country." So there was this issue. It wasn't all black and white. There were people on both sides of this issue, but in Mr. Kashino's case. What did you learn, or what do you think his attitude was when this call for volunteers for the 442 came out?
Yeah, you can only imagine how the split that happened within the camps, because there were lots and lots of people, as you said, who were like, "Are you kidding me?" Just like I was, right? Just like I said when I discovered the story of these guys volunteering. "Are you kidding me?" Right? But then there were guys like Shiro Kashino who said, "Look, you know, maybe there was some bravado in it. I don't know, but they didn't want to stay. They didn't think that living in a concentration camp out in the middle of the Idaho desert was the life they wanted to live forever, right? And nobody knew. Remember, nobody knew what was going to happen to them. They didn't know if that was going to be their life forever. And so Shiro decided that it was his opportunity to prove his loyalty as a Japanese American to the United States. And he felt that proving their loyalty would would earn them their rights as American citizens. And some might think that's unfair. Some might think you should never have to do that. But the fact of the matter is, those were the cards he was given. And so he decided, instead of, um, he decided not to be a victim. He decided to take responsibility and try to do something about it in his own way. And he and a bunch of other guys decided that their own way was to volunteer and fight for the United States Army and and fight America's enemies to prove their loyalty. But
Maybe
it was
this is a good
really
point
split.
to transition, maybe transition to what you mentioned earlier. You were interested in these two battles that Mr. Kashino participated in. So fast forward a couple years, right, into the European theater of war, and he's there with the 442nd. He's some sort of leader of some sort of platoon leader or something. Can you lead us through his experiences during those two battles?
Yeah, Shiro was a squad leader. One thing I just I want to offer and just mention, which I think is a fascinating story, was before they went to battle, they went to Camp Shelby for basic training. And one of the things that happened was that, there's all these Japanese American guys, right? Well, there were two groups of them. One group was from the mainland, the other group was from from Hawaii, and they hated each other. They hated each other. The guys in Hawaii hated the mainland guys because they thought they were stuck up, and the mainland guys didn't like the Hawaiian guys because the Hawaiian guys kept beating them up. And so, and where the mainland guys came individually from the camps or from areas outside the military intelligence zone, the Hawaiian guys came with their gangs of buddies, right? And so anyway, in my book, I talk about a lot of the reasons and what happened. But one of the stories came from Daniel Inouye, the late Senator Daniel Inouye, and he talked about how they almost had to disband the 442nd because they just they couldn't stand each other. And so one day, the leadership of the 442nd decided to take a one representative from Hawaii, from each barrack, and send them to a party. And so they load up their truck, these trucks full of these Japanese American guys from Hawaii, and they're playing their ukuleles and they're having a great time because they're gonna go have a party at a camp. And so Daniel Inouye says, and we came across this point in the road where we saw this military camp, and none of us knew that there was a military camp in that area. But then as we got closer, we saw that there was barbed wire on this camp. And he says we got really worried because instead of driving past the camp, the drivers made a right-hand turn right towards the entrance of the camp. And so they all got out. They thought they were in trouble. And so he said, and when he got out, he looked around and he looked into the camp behind the barbed wire. And he said, I saw people looking at me and they looked just like me. And he tells a story about how the guys from Hawaii had no idea that these camps were happening and that these Japanese Americans were incarcerated in these really god awful. I mean, these were not places where people held parties and campfires. I mean, these were places in these were camps in areas that people had no business living in. And so they went in, they learned, they tried to have they're just shocked. And the folks who were there, they gave them their rations, they gave them their bunks, and Daniel Inouye said, we just slept in the trucks. We just didn't have the heart. We tried to have, he says, a jolly old time. And he says on the truck ride home, there was no singing, there was no ukuleles, and he said, and we got back to camp, and every one of us went back to our barracks and told everybody what happened. And he says it was that night that the men of the 442nd became brothers. They had no idea what was happening. And so instead of disbanding the 442nd, these guys went on to war. The first they landed in Italy, fought some battles, but the Battle of the Gothic Line, no, I'm sorry, the Battle of the Lost Battalion happened in a forest in France called the Vosges Forest. And what happened was that a battalion of American soldiers found themselves surrounded by 600 Germans, and they had no way out. They were lost, and the view was that these guys had no chance whatsoever. The thing about this battalion that was lost, it was part of the Alamo Regiment, the famous Alamo Regiment, and literally the president of the United States got involved with this and said, "Get those guys out of there." And so there were two rescue attempts, and Both rescue attempts were repelled, and they couldn't get him out. And they called the 442nd in. In my book, I talk about the battle. I talk about what happened. I talk about how Shiro was shot twice, and each time he was shot, he would go to the aid station and run away before they could stop him to get back to the fight. Can you imagine that? I mean, anyway, and the only thing that kept him from going back was when he was heading back to the front line and he almost got his leg blown off, and he had no choice. But during that battle, uh, it was in imagine a forest where it's pitch dark. The enemy has had months to dig in, and you go into this battle to fight the enemy. You can't see them, and sometimes you step on them. And the only way that you can identify where they are is by becoming a target so you could see their machine gun flashes. Then you know where they are. And in this battle, there were these things that the Germans used called tree bursts. And the idea with the tree burst is that an artillery, when a bomb hits the ground, you got a kill zone of that radius of where the shrapnel goes. But what the Germans did, was they exploded the bombs at treetop level. So what happened was that blew up the treetops, and the trees became part of the weapon, and it was just terrible. It was terrible, and they fought for 3 days. They eventually broke through. There were Medal of Honor recipients from that battle, and and from that battle, 211 soldiers of the Lost Battalion were saved. 800 soldiers of the 442nd were lost. And even the commander of the quote unquote Lost Battalion, Marty Higgins, said there is no way they should have saved us. They should have passed us right by. And you know, a lot of people think back on that, and those who were there felt like they were cannon fodder. You know, they were Japanese Americans, so they were dispensable or expendable. But you know, the way that Cash looked at it and the way I look at it, and who cares how I look at it? So the way Cash looked at it was that who else was going to save him? And he said, you know, if he was a general, he would have sent us in too. And and he also looked at it as an opportunity to prove their courage and loyalty. And they did. And it became known as one of the top 10 battles in United States history. There's a portrait in the Pentagon that shows the Battle of the Lost Battalion. And so, but it was crazy. So he got 3 Purple Hearts out of that battle.
Amazing story. Amazing story.
Crazy.
And so this goes down in the annals of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team as their most famous battle. It was referred to later in the year, as the years passed by, to help the Nisei soldiers, the veterans, lobby first for statehood for Hawaii,
Yes.
and then later, as part of the redress movement to get the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which was initially named House Resolution 442, to remind the powerful Texas delegation of the sacrifices the Hawaii soldiers had made for their National Guardsmen from Texas. So thank you for that recap of that very famous battle. And then you wanted to talk about the Gothic Line campaign as well.
Yeah, the Gothic Line is one that's also very famous. This happened in Italy. So after the Battle of the Lost Battalion, they lost so many of their men that they had to take 4 months to replenish their numbers. Cash was laid up in a hospital because, like I said, he had a hole in his leg the size of a fist. And so Cash had the choice of going home back to Louise, right? But he wanted to stay with his men, and so he found his men in southern France, and there's a whole story of how he was court-martialed for something that he didn't do, but he was released eventually um, to fight in this battle of the Gothic Line. And the Gothic Line is a mountain range, the Apennine mountain range that spans the width of Italy from west to east. And throughout the history of warfare, the army that held the top of the Gothic Line was never successfully displaced. And during this time, the entire Fifth Army of the United States, roughly 200,000 men, for 6 months was not able to get the Germans off of the Gothic Line. And they had to take the Gothic Line in order to advance back into Germany. And so they called General Clark called the 442nd in, and the 442nd told them that not only can they take the Gothic Line, but they take the Gothic Line within 48 hours. And of course, nobody knew. Everybody's like, "What? Are you kidding me? Who are you guys?" Right? Their plan was something that no other army had ever thought of. You had the front side of the Gothic Line, and here's a picture of the Gothic Line from a little town called Azzano. And that little mountain peak on the far left is the westernmost point of the Gothic Line. And it goes all the way across Italy to the eastern shore. And so the idea that the 442nd came up with was that they were going to take the western end of the Gothic Line because once they took that end, they could sweep their way right across the mountaintops. And instead of fighting up the front side of the mountain range, where the roads were, where the paths were, where the access to the top of the mountains were, they proposed climbing up 3,000 feet in the dark of night on the backside of the Gothic Line, and which basically amounted to cliffs. And the idea was that they were going to do this in total secrecy, in total darkness. And the hope was that the Germans were not guarding the backside of the mountain range. And so these guys, 48, they marched for 2 days at night all the way up to this little town of Azzano. And this picture shows the town of Azzano from the top of the Gothic Line. And the men marched through a riverbed to the town of Azzano in the dark of night. And their march included a 1,000-foot climb, as you can see on that picture, to the town. And during the next day, they all hid. They all hid in this little town of Azzano. And the next night, they had to climb down 1,000 feet, march across a riverbed, and climb up 3,000 feet before the sun came up without making a sound and without being discovered. And the main order that they received was that if you fall, do not scream out. Don't make a sound. Because Cash said that if they were detected, there'd be 5,000 dead Buddha heads at the bottom of that mountain range. And so that's what they did. And they climbed. Now imagine climbing 3,000 feet in battle gear, with full battle gear, in army boots, on goat trails, in the dark of night, right? And having to be completely silent. They made it to the top. And this is a picture of one of the areas where they made it to the top. It's called the Saddle. And they made it to the top and they spread out. And they waited for the orders to attack at dawn. And so Daniel Lenoy told me a story about how where they reached the top of the Gothic Line, they happened to be near a German bunker. And while they were waiting for the order to attack, a German came out and started preparing breakfast. And he says, when we got the order, our order was to just take off and destroy everything we can. He says, I really felt badly for that cook. But when the order was given, they routed the Germans. and they took over the Gothic Line. There are stories in the story of how Daniel Inouye lost his arm and got his Medal of Honor is in the book. Just an amazing, amazing story. Um, but what happened was they basically took over the western end of the Gothic Line in 8 hours, 8 hours of battle, and just an incredible, incredible story of bravery and courage and 28 days after they won that battle, Italy surrendered, and I think it was 6 days after Italy surrendered that Germany surrendered. So it was a really, really important victory that the 442nd participated in.
Right. So this brings us to the end of the war in Europe in I think May of 1945. The 442nd, most of them were in Germany, say as occupation forces for about a year, and then they make their way back first to the east coast of the United States, and then later get all the way back to Hawaii in I think July of 1946, something like that. So Mr. Kashino at this point, he's recovered from his wounds. He's gotten out of his mix with the military authorities and he's released. And he goes what back to Seattle? What happened? Where
Yeah,
is
no,
Louise at this point?
they were in Chicago. So
Chicago.
Louise had moved to Chicago, and they tried to make a life there. But unfortunately, uh, despite his heroism and despite what the 442nd did, there were still a lot of prejudice against Japanese. And in some ways, it was worse than when the war started because a lot of people now looked at Japanese Americans as the enemy, but as the enemy conquered. And they weren't the enemy. They were, they were they were Americans, but still that perception or those feelings persisted. They ended up moving back to Seattle, and um, a lot of people had a really, really hard time. This photo is a photo of uh, one of the folks' homes when they came back to Seattle, and it was really tough. It was really tough. Even the veterans of foreign wars would not accept the Japanese Americans who fought for America, um, and so they didn't accept Japanese Americans. Can you imagine that? So they created their own communities. They created their own clubs. They created their own way to rebuild their lives. Because you have to know that a lot of these people they lost their homes, they lost their businesses, they lost their farms when they were incarcerated or interned, and a lot of them came home to nothing. They came home to nothing. So Shiro and Louise were a big, big part. They participated a lot in helping to rebuild the community. Shiro was involved with creating a really, really significant memorial in Seattle in honor of the 442nd. And he did things. He spent his life as a car salesman and that's what he did really well. And his daughters told me that the really cool thing about him being a car salesman was that they always had really cool cars. And but he did things like helping uh, young Japanese American sanseis, third generations, with drug addiction problems. And he was deputized by the Seattle police. And what would happen was that when some of these kids who were addicted to heroin would find themselves in trouble, the police would call Cash. And Cash and a friend of his who was a pharmacist would go and take care of the kids, and the pharmacist would give them methadone, which was a way to get these kids over uh, the drug effects for so that they can survive to the next day. And one of the things that I'm sorry I forget the pharmacist's name, but he wrote a letter to Louise after Cash died, and said, this is something you might not know about Cash. He took care of these kids and he never told their parents. He just took care of them, talked to them, and sent them on their way. And he did stuff like that. And he was an amazing guy, just an amazing guy, not only by the actions that I heard of, um, but uh, you know, by the testimony of people who knew him. He was just amazing.
Yeah, John, thank you so much for taking the tremendous effort over many years to research this story, write it, and share it with the American public. Thank you for all of that effort to do it. And two questions I'd like to ask you before we bring this
Hmm.
program to close. The first one is understanding this tremendous path or journey that you've been on to fulfill your own commitment to yourself, to bring this story of a Nisei man who volunteered out of internment or incarceration camp and fight for his country in a foreign land and risk his life and be wounded several times. Um, how do you feel about this having brought the story to fruition with the book?
Well, one of the things that was almost was said to me by almost everybody that I spoke to, even on the bus ride home, was don't let the world forget what we went through. Don't let the world forget, and do whatever you can to make sure this never happens again. And this is why I'm doing this. Writing books. One of the things I learned about writing books is that unless you're a Harry Potter author, you don't. The only people that make books are the people who tell you how to make books. And so, or no, the only people who make money on books are the people who tell you how to make books. And so, this isn't for money or fame or anything. It really is a calling. And like you said, it really was a journey of miracles, of having met. I mean, and so that's the first thing. But the other thing about this is, these guys are real heroes. It wasn't just Shiro. It wasn't just Cash. I mean, it was the entire 442nd, the entire 100th Battalion, all these guys, right? And I just want to make sure that everybody knows that these were amazing people at a really, really dark time of our history. And they inspired me. They inspired me because, um, the shortest the shortest path to victimhood is to blame others for what's going on in your life. And
Right.
these guys didn't. They refused to be victims. And that's really inspiring to me.
And
And
it's a lesson that those of us in the following generations can aspire to emulate, right?
right.
The second question, if I could,
Yeah.
is tell me about the title of the book, American Grit. What 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 caused you to name the book, give the book that title?
That's a really great question. It took me a long, long time to come up with that name. Um, those two words mean a lot to me, right? It is very much an American story. It's a story about patriotism. It's a story about love. It's a story um, about courage. And the part about grit, you know, that was the one characteristic that stood out with everybody I spoke to. Everybody who was in those camps, men who were adults at the time or were kids at the time, right? Women. Um, it was just grit. It was grit. It was beyond courage. It was beyond determination. It's just a raw attribute that they all had in surviving this part of their lives and this part of their experience. And again, these people didn't know whether they were going to spend the rest of their lives in these camps or not. And in their own way, they buckled down and they made it happen. They made it happen. They made their communities work. Um, and so, the whole idea of American grit is these folks, um, these folks really lived what I think it means to be American and lived that level of courage that is uniquely American.
Thank you so
Um,
much for sharing, John.
yeah. Can I just share one more quick story?
Sure, absolutely. This is
Okay.
your program.
Yeah. So I just want to share this story because we talked about this being an amazing journey of just things that happen. George Morihiro was uh, a man who fought side by side with Cash at the Battle of the Gothic Line. And I heard about George Morihiro. I wanted to meet George Morihiro. And so I went on a I went on a mission to find George Morihiro. I couldn't find him. Well, one day, my son and I went to visit my mom in her assisted living center. And so we went to her room and the key didn't work. And I'm like, why isn't the key working? So I knocked on the door and nobody answered. And so my son says to me as we're standing there, he says, Dad, who's George Morihiro? I said, how'd you come up with that name, George Morihiro? He says, look, his name's on the door. And there was George Morihiro's name on the door. What happened was instead of hitting the second floor on the elevator where my mom lived, oh, I'm sorry, instead of hitting the third floor, my son hit the second floor. And it turned out that George Morihiro was living on the second floor of the building right below my mom. She was living 10 feet from him. And it was at that moment that I went, okay, this is
What
this
we
is a
call in Hawaii a chicken skin
chicken
moment.
skin moment. Yeah, that's right.
Like, what's going on here? We're in the
Yeah,
Twilight Zone.
yeah. But it's been the honor of my life.
Mhm.
Meeting the people, going to the battlefields, just learning. I'm trying to do my best to fulfill the promise I made.
So
To do my best to make sure this doesn't happen again and to let people know so we don't forget.
thank you, John. Thank you for all of your hard work, sharing with us this wonderful path that you were on to bring us the story of Mr. Shiro Kashino of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a story that we should all be aware of and learn and treasure. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this program here today. Aloha.
Yeah, thank you, Burns. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.